of the Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities. I'll go over the agenda in just a minute. Few reminders, if anybody is watching on YouTube and is not on this screen, we will have public comment towards the end of the call. At that point, I'll need you to jump over onto the Zoom if you're intending to address the group, and we'll have time for that. Members of the committee, if you're in places where it's safe and comfortable to do so, we'd love to have you on camera. A couple of other just quick reminders on the administrative side. We do ask that when members speak, they identify themselves the first time by full name and after that by first name, so folks know who's talking. And we do try to avoid, and by avoid I mean don't at all use the chat unless it's critical that you get a message just to me or to Carrie. Otherwise, use of that can really be distracting, not only to folks using screen readers, but really to the conversation itself. So we avoid using the chat function altogether. With that said, let me just give a high-level preview of plans for today's call. I did not get a ton of comments in the Google Docs. We're actually going to walk through that. I want to make sure everyone is comfortable with the language. We'll have opportunity to refine, but those ideas, which I think are the first 8 ideas from this subcommittee, along with the first batch of ideas from the government subcommittee in their conversation about running for office, those will go live on Engage Dora tomorrow. We will send everybody the link, and it will be time to start getting stakeholder input on what they see as the strengths, what additional things they want considered. As I've shared on previous calls, we are not putting these out as these are the recommendations. These are being shared as these are ideas under consideration as we develop recommendations. We're also not asking people for a yes, no, love, hate, support, oppose. It's really, what do you see as the strengths of this? What do you see as the implications or the considerations? What might we be missing? And what do you want this committee to think about as we tighten these up and develop our ultimate recommendations? So the first block of time will be spent revisiting these ones that we developed a few weeks ago, which are really focused on contracts, publications, and communications. After that, we're going to spend some time on the data side. What data do we think needs to be collected specifically, and what are the ideas we may want to propose in terms of calling for mandatory collection of data, where we think data might want to be collected, and how are we going to get at a state that is not only informed in the moment, but stays on an ongoing basis, current and informed about the demand for, the need for, and the inventory of affordable, accessible housing. Before I bring in the whole discussion, does anyone have any questions about the plan for today's calls or where we're going to be going with this? I am seeing none. We do have one member of the executive committee, Representative Ortiz, who's the vice chair, on the call. So Representative Ortiz, if there's anything you'd like to offer for us to be thinking about, and so members know, I'm always going to be inviting members of the executive committee to address us at the top of our call in case there's things they want us to discuss. Then they're going to let us have our conversation. When we have these 2-hour calls, I'll invite them in midway in case they want to reflect on anything, and then again as we close. Representative Ortiz, anything you want to offer to this group as we review the ideas around contracts and communications and then get into a conversation about data? Okay, I will invite him in if he'd like to jump in later. I know he's been juggling a ton of calls lately, so he may be having to multitask during this.
No, my internet was going in and out, so just want to thank everybody for their time. I appreciate the work that they're doing. I look forward to hearing y'all dig into and discuss these ideas. It's been really rewarding and gratifying to hear the different subcommittees as we approach decision time to start really digging into fleshing out these ideas and asking the tough questions. As always, focused on securing basic access and basic rights for people living with disabilities. So thank you all.
Thank you, Representative. And as I always do, before I even read these ideas, I'm going to ground us back in what we've been tasked with doing. According to the legislation that created this, House Bill 1296, the purpose of the Housing Subcommittee is to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure and affordable, accessible and attainable housing for persons with disabilities and to make recommendations for addressing those barriers. Today, we're focusing on 2 elements of that you all have identified. Previously, things around contracts and plain language contracts, the accessibility of them, the communications. Then we'll go into this question, because we were asked to outline the need for an inventory of accessible housing in Colorado. And I know everybody remembers multiple conversations we've had about what that means, what data exists, and what data doesn't exist. So what I'm going to do is walk us through one by one each of the ideas we've developed. These were on the document that was shared. And what I want to do is just ask folks, does this still feel right for us to share? Are there any refinements, or did I get the wording wrong as I tried to capture all of your thoughts? I will remind, we're not here to try to say this entire committee supports it. It's just a matter of, do we want to share this idea with the public to get their reactions to it? So the first idea generated was to require all residential leases and associated legal agreements to be provided in plain language and in accessible forms for individuals with any type of disability. Would anybody like to react to this, continue to support it, or offer revisions to that? I see a thumbs up from Anais.
Hi, this is Brian Rosberg with Housing Colorado. I think, one interesting thing that just stuck out to me, and I don't know why it just struck me now, is I know that this committee is charged with focusing on the rights of folks with disabilities, but the plain language contract thing, I think, goes beyond. That the kind of qualifier on the end there of for people with disabilities might actually, interestingly enough, exclude others who might be in need of plain language contract. And I don't know if that qualifier needs to be there for us to make the recommendation. It just struck me now as something that might be helpful for all people to have plain language contract.
I think that's entirely possible. And I don't know that I heard in any of your conversations an intent to say, save these plain language versions only for those with a disability. Paul, I saw you start to raise your hand.
I don't know if this is the right one, but somewhere the concept of standardized state or other, just standardized agreements where we can rely on the trust of that standard.
Got it. Let me make a note to consider on that. And we do have a few others in terms of states providing model templates. Does anyone have a concern or objection to striking for persons with disabilities to where the idea we're getting feedback would simply read, require all residential leases and associated legal documents to be provided in plain language and in accessible forms for all individuals? David.
So having everything in, I think we need to strike it because then a person with a disability automatically has to identify themselves as having a disability right up front.
Yep.
And so I want to take that language out. I think plain language contracts, residential leases, the bylaws of HOAs, those kinds of things should all be in plain English because they put so much legalese in there that most people, you've seen that commercial of the guy wanting to switch his cell phone status and they drop a 3-inch stack of papers and he goes, do I need a lawyer for this? Well, you almost need a lawyer to read and understand leases and housing contracts, those kinds of things. So plain language is great, and I think it should be. I agree with Paul. It should be across the board.
Right. Then it has been stricken and now is not limited. If everyone's okay, I'm going to continue on to our next idea. This one currently reads, direct the Division of Housing to work with disability advocates, the Colorado Disability Opportunity Office, which you may recall was just created in this web session, and others as appropriate to develop guidance and best practices for ensuring leases or other agreements and publications are accessible to individuals with a disability. Now, this one, I'm curious folks' thoughts. This is having DOH, the Division of Housing, very specifically focus on best practices and guidance for making sure things are accessible to Coloradans with a disability. Does anyone have the similar concerns you had on the earlier one, or does this seem appropriate that we're focusing this guidance on making sure they're accessible to Coloradans with disabilities?
I just want to add, I shared some of these potential recommendations with Tim Dolan, who has joined us previously and is a great advocate. He's worked for the Division of Housing previously and has a lot of insights for how some of these things could work. And with other advocates as well, we seem to find that there should be a designated role for that at the Division of Housing or even at DOLA. We find that there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right? And sometimes the chefs don't talk to each other effectively. So having a centralized role within that division is the recommendation that we kind of came to that would be effective moving forward to coordinate and to have really a centralized knowledge of what's going on at the state level.
Understood. And Anais, because we had a similar conversation come up yesterday on another conversation, we were talking about a dedicated contact person. I want to be clear. Are we talking about one individual who is the contact for these inquiries, or are we saying there must be an individual at DOLA or DOH whose only job is serving in this role?
Yes, we wanted to keep it very specific as this is the sole focus. I mean, especially for the clients that we serve and the Tim Dolan is advocating for the IDD community. We really need as easy as possible, connected back to that plain language, really just make it as streamlined and as effective so that people aren't having to, hunt for who to talk to about these things.
Got it. I just wanted to clarify. Anyone have any reactions or questions on that? Let me go to Shelley and then David.
Yeah, I should have raised my hand, David.
Okay.
So I would just, Anais, thank you for calling that out. I think having a dedicated person is the right approach to take because they're in the affordable housing community today. There are some challenges that have been experienced with Division of Housing. And so layering this on top of some of the other challenges could just, I don't know how effective it would be. And so important to call out to say that there's someone dedicated to that work would be important.
And for complete transparency, so you all know, our team is currently working with DOLA on their strategic plan. We spent a lot of time with the DOH staff. I have not seen any member of the Division of Housing who has spare time on their hands. So Anais and Shelley, I appreciate your comments and I expect that Allison and the team there would as well. David, your thoughts on this?
So I agree that there should be one dedicated person. Anais mentioned there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. They all have a different recipe too.
Yeah.
And the trouble is when you are talking about how to work with people with disabilities, we need people who have some specific training in working with the large variety of people with disabilities, working with the deaf community, with the blind community, with IDD, with people with mental illness. I mean, it's traumatic brain injury. It takes someone who's going to receive some training and that it's a one contact person that the community can go to help a person get housing.
Thank you, David. So I just revised the language that I'm inserting. I don't know if anybody's following along, but I've got a comment to add that they include a dedicated contact person for inquiries who has appropriate training and knowledge working with individuals with a broad range of disabilities. Does that get it, what the group is looking for? Great. Rochelle.
I would only like to expand upon that being more than one full-time person, that it be a minimum of one full-time person and that it could be scaled up as needed, because I cannot imagine the load. We had a housing briefing today with 180 people standing in line, and that was in Weld County. So just that many questions and how many staff it takes us to manage the housing choice vouchers that we manage. One person statewide is going to be taxed.
I'm going to revise the language right now to a minimum of 1 FTE. I'm going to bring an Anais in, and then I'm going to jump forward because we've got another idea that has to do with creating a navigator for property owners. So I want to talk about these together. Anais, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I second that to Rochelle. At minimum 1, I mean, it would be ideal to have individuals in different jurisdictions because each county has a different need and a different condition that needs to be well addressed and acknowledged. One of the suggestions that we had from a different advocate is a committee of individuals with lived experience to support this position. So really ensuring that the voices of those that we serve and that are willing to be forthright and self-advocates around this issue could be participants in it to inform their processes. So that could be maybe another way to balance out that individual's role. If it's just one, at least having an inclusion of voices that can be supported by that at least one individual.
So I will work on language to catch this, but I want to share what I'm getting is direct that in addition to the minimum FTE, they form a advisory group of individuals with lived experiences to provide guidance and input to that individual or individuals. Okay, I'm going to jump. That's idea number 2, in case anyone's following along. I'm going to jump to idea 7, because I think there's some connections. If we find that they aren't, fine. But we'd come up with the idea to establish within an appropriate division of state government an accessibility navigator position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing and to assist individuals with disabilities navigating the housing markets. Do we want to combine these two ideas? Do you want to keep the advising property owners separate from the FTE who would advise individuals? This one we had left as an appropriate division of government because I thought the idea was it may be CDU, the new office. We're talking a lot about division of housing. So let me just open it up to group conversation on this. David, please.
So I think it should be separate because it can't be the one person or group of people at the Division of Housing because that would make it overwhelming and and realistically very difficult to fund and maintain funding. I think it's better to be in the new office for disabilities, just because we want to make sure that that office then is providing quality information, and they'll do a better job of making sure everything is consistently going out to landlords.
Does anyone feel differently? Okay, then for the moment, I'm going to set that one aside. We'll come back to it to workshop it. But I just wanted to make sure, since we're talking about creating navigators, if we wanted to combine, fine. But David, your point is well taken. Pulling back up, we go in a much different direction with idea number 3. Require any publication or other advertisement for a property available for lease that lists any features of the unit or property to list all accessibility features, which should include, but not be limited to, available accessible parking spots, number of elevators, which common building amenities are accessible, and which common building amenities are accessible, such as pools, common rooms, etc. So this was just this idea, as you all were talking about, when apartments are listed and there's these classifieds, whether online or otherwise, making sure that if they say anything about the unit's features, they'd be required to list the accessibility features as well. Anais, is your hand up anew on this one or still up?
I believe that was from last time.
Okay. this idea still feel right? Did I capture your intention correctly? Cassidy.
Yeah, I like this. The only thought I have as maybe an addition are accessibility features of the unit as well. So what I see here is we're kind of talking about like things that are outside of the unit, like a elevator or parking space, but I think like the accessibility features of the actual unit itself should be added to this, like are there grab bars in the bathroom? Are there lowered countertops, stuff like that?
I appreciate that. And let me see if people want to offer any more specifics. The lead-in language does say any feature of the unit or property. You're right when I read the including but not limited to, those were then property. So in addition to counter heights, grab bars, are there other things? And again, we're not trying to include everything. It's examples of what types of things. And we can certainly get more specific when we refine our recommendation. But are there other unit features you would like to name in the idea we share with the public? Paul.
Hi, Paul here. I guess the ones I'd suggest is adding communication features.
Hmm.
So ANSI defines the type A and the type B units, and then units with communication features. And then garage parking that's accessible or non-accessible, that's a commonly designed item as well.
Yep.
The other stuff as far as countertop heights, etc., I would just want a definition to everything so that there's no subjectivity.
Yeah, and I do want to be clear, we could probably turn this one idea into about a page length list. For now, what we want to do is get stakeholder reaction to the idea itself. And folks there may offer specifics. I'm not trying to tell you not to include anything. I'm just saying that there's going to be plenty of time for us to really tighten these up. And I want to make sure that they feel digestible to the public. Rochelle.
The only one that I know that we've really struggled with and our consumers have struggled with is roll-in showers. We can kind of get around narrow doorways, but roll-in showers usually cost us like an extra 6 to 18 months to try to find a unit for somebody.
Consider it added. And I see a handful of you in there. Paul.
If I may just suggest the roll-in showers and the units with communication features maybe belong under number 4, not number 3.
So let me go to 4 and talk to all of you if we want to combine these or how we want to separate them. As Paul looks ahead, the next item is simply require any multi-unit property to list the number of available type A and type B units. So this was just asking the property owners for the data on it. The previous one was more about the advertising and disclosing all of the features that exist. I'm happy to revise these, but let me get group thought on, do we combine, do we keep separate? Where do we put features? And again, it was about transparency on what's really available there. Cassidy.
I personally think that they are separate enough ideas to keep them separately, but I do like Paul's suggestion of listing the number of available type A, type B, and units with communication features, because like he said, that is a specific type of unit in the codes.
So Paul, would it be appropriate for me to rewrite that as require any multi-unit property to list the number of available type A and type B units with communication features, or is it type A, type B, and those with communication features?
They're 3 separate classes of
Okay,
units.
got it.
And then the roll-in shower is a 4th distinct class.
Got it. So it'd be type A units, type B units, units with communication features, and units with roll-in showers.
Yes.
Got it. Do we still keep those references? This is just me trying not to assume anything. Do we keep the reference to communication features in union and roll-in showers also in the above language about advertising and the types of features they would list as included or available? Any strong feelings one way or the other?
Eric, I have a question on when we say communication features, what do we mean?
Paul, do you want to speak to that?
I'll probably miss something, but a doorbell, a light, and audible alarm that goes off in the event of fire. And I think there's one or two other things that code requires.
And Paul, this is a place where I'm not an expert. Are those described, do you know, as accessibility related communication features? I'm trying to think of this going to the very general public, the small business, the one apartment or property owner. When they see communication features, they may think telephones or internet, and I see Rep. Ortiz saying, yes, they are. Would it be appropriate for me to describe these as accessibility related communication features?
I believe so.
Okay. I will do some checking before we make these live, but I'm just trying to simplify this and make sure the language is understood by people who have never been a part of any of these conversations.
Yeah, if you want to
It's a
expand on
reference.
it,
Oh, I was
I
just
think
gonna say,
it's-
maybe it's a reference to code. Accessibility related or accessibility features related, or communication features related to code. Somewhere in there, be able to make that connection, Paul?
yeah, I think UFAS calls it hearing/vision accessible units with communication features.
Okay, I have code pulled up, so I will go add the appropriate language rather than consuming too much time here of yours, but we'll get that right. Anais.
So this is very much not an area of expertise for me as far as the architecture and really how much knowledge do property managers and developers know about the difference between type A, type B, all these accessibility features. How do we, it's more of a general question. How is that assessed? How much knowledge do these developers or property managers need to know about this from the get-go? How does all that work in understanding the type of unit?
Well,
Paul and Shelley, let me go to you. And Shelley, I'll go to you first and then to Paul.
well, I would say I'd let Paul go first, but I'll just say our experience is we're working with the architect firm and closely looking at all the codes and understanding what the requirements are, what we can and can't do, what the cost is related to that. And so that's not in here. It's like, as we put these requirements here, what are we saying to developers from a cost standpoint as well? Are we asking them to do something above and beyond what's already being required? But I would say early on in the design development phase, those are relationships between the developer and the architect firm, usually. And the general contractor is in that loop as well.
Yeah.
Paul, any thoughts you want to layer in there?
I guess I'd add repeat developers learn the lingo, but one-offs don't know it. And we're often just presented with a form that says, certify that you meet all these different standards. But on every drawing submittal we make to a building department, we have to list those quantities of units. So it is defined in that permit set. And so it'd be an easy linkage to make from that set of documents to publish it to the wider public.
And just for public consumption, what I've just done for anybody watching in the doc is I moved what was idea 7 about this navigator for property owners to immediately follow these 2 ideas where we're laying out what property owners must do. So as people are going through this and saying, how the heck are property owners going to know, we get to that next point.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
If I may just add one more class unit.
Please.
type C. It's the visitable.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and workshop the one we touched on around the navigator, since I've moved it up to follow all of these things we're going to ask property owners to do and know. It currently reads, establish within an appropriate division or state government an accessibility navigator position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing and to assist individuals with disabilities navigating the housing markets. My first question, before we go into everything we're doing for property owners, do you want to keep that second part of and assist individuals navigating the housing markets? Or is that what we've done with the positions you're recommending at the Division of Housing? I'm seeing nods and shakes. If somebody can come off mute. I'm trying not to interpret too much or assume much. Brian.
I would say it seems a bit repetitive to have, and it seems like a very big task for one office to do both the property side and the navigator and the individual side of things.
Then unless Rochelle is raising her hand to object, I will strike, but Rochelle, I'll give you the opportunity first.
I think they are individual positions, but what that position will be, the DOH one to me kind of screams more along the lines of navigating the housing voucher program, since that's where most of the folks that we see are having issues with. The one that we're speaking of with the navigation side in this is directed more towards the property owners and towards the housing navigation agencies that already exist in the community. So I see that being more as a point person to the different agencies that are individually helping consumers, but being still needing to have some of that expertise about the community and what individual needs are.
I will do some work refining our DOH position to clarify the background and knowledge we expect them to have, the advisory group, and the role they serve. Focusing on this one, again, we're reading establishing a navigator position or office to provide technical assistance to property owners seeking to comply with requirements and meet greater standards of transparency of the availability of accessible housing. With full note that you're going to have to tighten this up if you, based on the stakeholder feedback, you want to advance this, we'll get this far more structured in what that role is. What are your thoughts on this as the idea to share with the public in a digestible form? Paul.
Maybe a different way we could take this suggestion is Denver. Every development proposal we submit through their site development plan process, there's somebody who reviews it from an accessibility standpoint. So there's somebody on staff that provides suggestions. And it could just be that every jurisdiction must have somebody on staff that reviews building permits or site applications with a lens of accessibility. And it doesn't, I don't know, there's just too many jurisdictions that say we're immune, we're not going to look at it.
So I want to clarify with you and then open it up to the group. If I'm hearing you correctly, are you suggesting that in addition to a state office that serves to provide technical assistance, we require every municipality that permits homes to have a dedicated person that reviews, or that every jurisdiction be instructed to review permits with an eye towards accessibility?
I think it could be in lieu of the state position, because some jurisdictions already have that person. It's just maybe making it a requirement that every jurisdiction at least give it a look.
So let me put to the group, since we had some general support on this the last time, you're free to strike this today, or you could float both ideas to the public and get reaction to either the state or the municipal. I will just encourage you to consider what it would look like to require that in every municipality across the state. And that's not me advocating for or against. I just want us to think about what challenges or what strengths that could be, Paul, as you said, since there's already some folks doing that. Let's just have a little bit of a discussion on, is this something we want to suggest the state incorporate into, whether it's CDU or DORA or DOLA, or is this something that should be handled at the local level?
So I would just go back to, I think, maybe Paul's comments of like where some jurisdictions don't feel like they have a responsibility. And so does this provide more accountability on them to, like, it doesn't mean your jurisdiction or county is immune to providing accessibility requirements or sharing that insight.
So Shelley, let me ask you, would that mean the state enacting a law that requires municipalities in every jurisdiction to have such? Is it a matter of the state enforcing that they do comply? Are we talking about the state filling in where locals don't? What is the idea that could get at that issue of some do and some don't?
Well, I would say what gets to it is when it's a requirement, you know, you can't bypass it, right? But that is very, I mean, it's saying this is important to Colorado, and that's the difference versus the state saying, yeah, we'd like you to report it if you run across this.
So would the idea be we strike creating an office or navigator position at the state, and instead we require every jurisdiction to provide technical assistance to property owners and to ensure compliance? Are you suggesting that the jurisdictions take on this whole, or are we scrapping the entire idea of this navigator and simply saying every municipal jurisdiction must include accessibility in their permitting and inspection processes? Paul?
I guess one delineation I'd like to make is even when they inspect life safety provisions, they're granted governmental immunity.
Yep.
So I wouldn't want this to be a more stringent ask. It's simply that they give it some thought and not just trust the professionals.
Do you want to offer some language here for me, Paul? Is this that we're requiring every jurisdiction to include consideration of accessibility in building permitting and inspection processes?
In the review of development applications and building permits.
And oh, sorry, I meant to raise my hand, but just another general question, as you guys are experts in this area. If we're saying we want to encourage it, is that currently what's happening now, or there's a general encouragement and still others are attempting to bypass that? Or is there, is there a middle ground there between saying you have to and then saying feel free if you want to? Is there a middle ground between those two ends?
Paul, your hand is up and you've been active in the conversation. I also would love checking my language if we're talking about during development approval and building permit processes. But I want to get to Anais' question first.
I was just going to say, from practice, the larger jurisdictions that have a bigger review staff seem to offer those comments. So Aurora, Denver, we regularly get those comments. And then as you get to smaller jurisdictions, it's rare that we get comments or anybody looking at it with that lens.
Paul, while I've got you off mute, the language I tried to capture was consideration of accessibility features in development approval and building permit processes. Is that?
How about and building permit reviews?
Got it. Thank you.
Or applications.
Thank you. So we have stricken the creating the state navigator and streamlined it with require that all jurisdictions include consideration of accessibility features in development approval and building permit applications. David, and then I'll get to you, Paul.
Okay, so this is a little bit off, but I know that over my years of working with like home modifications around the state, there's a lot of jurisdictions that you don't even get a permit to do construction. And so they don't have anybody reviewing anything. And so I think having the state navigator still makes a lot of sense to me, just because we're also could be putting a burden on some very poor counties in frontier areas of the state. And Colorado Counties is going to lobby hard against that.
And I will tell you on a totally different topic, we're working on some types of fire code. And we've heard the same thing. In that case, it's around wildfire. And we've heard the same thing, that we have a bunch of counties that don't have fire marshals approving buildings and sites. So you've got to have both the state to backfill and the expectation on the local jurisdictions. Let me go to Paul and then Anais.
So maybe if it's the state person that's wearing this hat, their charge or our recommendation is that that person standardize or organize or help create a more robust and consistent review and approval process for all the local jurisdictions.
And I don't want to speak for members. I did not hear in David's comments suggesting we eliminate this. I was hearing have the requirement that the local jurisdictions include this, with the note that we also need the state to backfill. But David, correct me in what you were suggesting.
You got it right.
Okay. So we're going to ask those locals that have someone to do their job and ensure accessibility is considered. And we're going to create a state office to provide that technical assistance and navigation and backfill where we don't have local authorities performing that function. Anais.
Yeah, I would second what David said, because really concerned about those rural communities. I know there's usually a lot more freedom and lax around these regulations, which is rightfully, their right to want those things, but really concerned about our community members with disabilities and having someone to support or oversee that process, I think would ease some of those concerns of mine.
Excuse me, I'm just adding notes as we're talking. Rochelle, jump in.
Sorry, I didn't see myself in line there, but thank you for that. I do think some of the discussions that we've had about the CDU office, this could be the place where that lies. I know we'll figure out the logistics later, but just giving some information about that might put the counties at ease a bit, knowing that there is an entirely new office, and we can just thank everybody that has one of those nice black license plates for supporting that. And I think that would be a very good use of those resources in the CDU office, and then making sure that that's a support for every county.
As a Coloradan, who was born here and grew up on those green license plates, I'm not sure I'm ready to embrace the black ones, but if their money will fund this, I'm all for it. We were currently saying, in an appropriate division of state government, do you all want to name CDU as the place this should sit, or do you want to leave this open to it being DOLA, DORA, CDU, wherever it may land? Thoughts? Brian, your hand's up. Jump in.
Sure. I like the appropriate office because there's beyond, like in DOLA, there's beyond Division of Housing. There's a Division of Local Government,
yeah.
And they do some regulation already on like codes for manufactured housing. So there is some of that work that already happens within DOLA, the kind of broader umbrella. So I think that might make more sense just to keep it broad for now. And it could be that CDU is the place for it. But I know there's some work that already happens in this regard.
Yeah.
Or similar work.
good point. Anais and Paul, your hands are up, but I know we've been putting them up and down, so just checking in. Got it. Okay, so we've got both of these ideas, and I've added to the navigator that they would perform the roles we discuss about jurisdictions, consider accessibility features in development approval where the jurisdiction doesn't have someone performing that function. I'm going to move us on to one more, and then one or two more. So everyone knows I've asked you to sit at your desk for 2 hours. At the top of the hour, we'll take a 5-minute break for folks to do whatever is needed midway through a long meeting. Our next idea, number 7, as the running Google Doc works, is to establish a statewide process and requirement for conducting an accessibility report on properties when they are bought, sold, or refinanced to confirm compliance with federal and state disability laws. Paul.
Just one suggestion that we make that person a licensed professional that reviews it. Or some expert qualification.
And do you have a suggestion? Because I don't know that there is a license for compliance with disability laws right now. Do we want to say a person with appropriate training, or what would you like? What would you propose?
The person we hire to review him is a licensed architect.
Okay.
And I think on like construction defect stuff, you have to be an architect or an engineer to review other architect and engineers' work. So that'd be my suggested starting point.
So by a licensed architect.
Or engineer.
Or engineer.
Yeah.
Got it. Other thoughts on this requirement? Excuse me, this idea that we will share, that would be a requirement. Okay, the next one builds on that, and in fact, it starts off building on the information above. Direct CDU to collaborate with the Department of Revenue and other state agencies to maximize the current and future collection of data to support the greatest available information about the inventory of accessible and adaptable housing. I'm going to ask a question before we go into this. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about what data we want to collect. Does this item belong in communications and contracts, or should I pull this and have this in our list of data collection? David.
I think it belongs in data collection.
Any disagreements with that? Okay. I think the ideas were flowing at the end of our last meeting, so I will bump that to our data collection ideas. The last idea we had may also go with that, because it was consider state grants to nonprofits, community organizations, NGOs, or local housing authorities for dedicated programs to provide similar or complementary, maybe the states, complementary services to those described what was at the time our navigator. So this was about, should we provide grants to nonprofits or other organizations to complement the services we're now proposing that the Division of Housing provide? Thoughts on that? Any concerns about the bifurcation, splitting it between Division of Housing, having the FTE, but possible other grants to supplement those services? Is that a worthwhile idea to test? David.
So I think it's a worthwhile idea, and the grantees would also work directly with the Division of Housing folks in doing this, so that everybody is providing a similar message.
So I'm just going to add then, David, to the end of this, in collaboration with Division of Housing.
Perfect.
Other thoughts on that one? Does that feel right to everyone? Okay, then that tightens it up. We've got 8 ideas we will take to the public. What we've done is moved data to our data discussion coming up next. We refined the idea around providing guidance and best practices to ensure we've got a minimum of an FTE at the Division of Housing. We added the idea of requiring jurisdictions to consider accessibility in approval and building permit applications. But otherwise, all of our ideas have stayed the same. It's just clarifying what's happening at the Division of Housing and that's an FTE at minimum with appropriate knowledge and training, working with an advisory group of those with lived experiences. Does everyone feel good about this being our first set of ideas to get some public input on? Okay, then what I'm going to do, it's 3:53. This feels like the best time to take a break before we completely shift topics. Why don't we make it a full 7 minutes, go crazy here. At 4 p.m., let's all be back on screen and ready to talk data. Okay, I appreciate everybody jumping right back on at 4. I think a few people are straggling back on, but I'm going to get us right into the conversation. We've been talking policy, we've been talking function. Now we're about to get really wonky. A big part of our charge, and as you recall, as we went into it, we found a big absence of information to support it, has been this question of what is the current inventory of affordable, accessible housing, and what is the future need and demand for it. If you remember going back to February and March when we were having these conversations, it seemed like a very straightforward question. How many units are there? How many people need them? Then we started asking crazy questions like, well, where are these units? Who are they accessible for? What surrounds them? What counties are they in? What do we know about the future or the current or future demographics? And what we ran into was really some very limited data that's not the fault of anyone at the state or local level. It's simply been what they've been instructed historically to gather and maintain. And some of that was on a rolling 10-year basis, or didn't really drill down into what types of disabilities. And some of you and some of our guests highlighted that there is this tendency to consider accessible housing as strictly related to mobility disabilities. And did that mean zero curbs? Did that mean wider doors? Did that mean grab rails? But we were talking about a lot of the full spectrum of disabilities, whether that's visual, hearing, or learning and intellectual. So what we want to start talking about is, in order to identify what the inventory is and demand is, what data should we be collecting? And in this case, we're kind of beyond, we've had a lot of conversation of we should collect it down to the county level or maybe the city level. We've talked about we should identify, and in our earlier ideas, we got to what type of accessibility features. What we haven't even begun to talk about is, okay, who's going to do it and why are they going to do it? Are we going to pass a law that requires cities to collect this information? Are we going to create an office or direct a current office of the state to start collecting, to go survey and collect this? Is this something we're going to collect on current inventory? Is this something we're going to start tracking on new developments and on renovations through the permitting process? And I'm not advocating for any of these. I'm simply laying out what we've got to work through over the next hour or so. And that is, what data do we want to collect? How do we want to collect it? And who do we want to tell they have to collect it? So with that cornucopia of problems to solve, I will open it to discussion. Brian and then Paul, please jump in.
So I might want to jump to maybe the second part of that and the how and the who. I guess maybe second and third. Just last year in the legislative session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 174, which requires local governments and the state to conduct a housing needs assessment. I think that there's kind of an avenue perhaps there to insert, when we come up with what data is to be collected, to maybe look at that statute as an opportunity, because this is, it's on a pretty long time horizon, but it could be an opportunity just to not reinvent the wheel completely, but as municipalities in the state are conducting housing needs assessments, to consider this. And I'm regretting that I didn't think about this then. That could have been incorporated from the get-go, but that might just be one thing we want to consider, and the how is looking at that statute.
And 174, for those not familiar, and Brian, you may know even more than I do, it's really on the future needs side of the housing market. It's not really doing anything. I guess it will inventory, it'll look at what we have, but its focus really is on what do we, based on demographic predictions and projections, expect to need. Is that correct?
It is an assessment of what exists, and then inserting, okay, we expect this kind of population growth according to the state demographer. What is then our housing need moving forward in, say, the next decade or so?
So let's go there. And Paul, I'm going to bring you in next, but I'm going to, invite Brian back in and Anais and everyone. If we're going to piggyback on 174's work, what specifically might we want to name that we're asking them to collect? Paul, you can go there, or you can go with whatever else was on your mind.
I have a different avenue, so if anybody wants to go there, I'll let them.
I had a question about 174. I know it's in early days, but one of the concerns we have here at the ARC and other stakeholders of ours is aging caregivers. Do we know if 174, if that's the type of assessment data that they're hoping to look at, to look at the potential aging caregivers who are currently, supporting our Coloradans with disabilities with housing, but, moving forward might not, within the next 5-10 years, that will change dramatically their ability to care for them and house them. So more of a question for those who are more knowledgeable about 174 and what that includes, because that would change whether I think that should be piggybacked onto that.
I don't believe that was a part of it, but it could be something that we say, as a part of doing a statewide housing needs assessment, you consider these things, that are already included in the legislate or in the statute now. And on top of that, try to wrap your arms around this issue that is coming up, or upon us, really.
So Anais, build on that for me. If you could wave the wand and we could get those designing the implementation of 174 to collect everything we want to know about the current inventory and the features, as well as what we know from the demographer's office with Elizabeth and her team, what would you want to see on that information collection?
Yeah, aging caregivers is a really big concern. Locally, at least, and what we know in our county, there's a number of aging caregivers who are frankly stressed out, anxious, concerned about the future of the individuals that they support. And so that comes top of mind. Additionally, just general services that people are already accessing and will need to continue accessing to age in place, to really have a permanent housing. So many things, especially for the IDD community, cause that revolving door of homelessness, and ongoing support and services is a prevention to that. So aging caregiver data on, the prospective need for inventory given that, and then access to services as well. Do you already have access to services? Is that something you're going to need long-term to age in place and remain housed?
Paul, jump in.
So I have 2 or 3 pages of notes on this. And I'll apologize in advance, but I guess I have some strong opinions on this. The first is a fear that I think policy is always going to be like, what's the right percent of type A units? Type A units really only affect 18% of housing in the US, according to census stats. So I think right there, that's my fear, is that 75% of housing is duplex, single family, and manufactured and mobile. And mobile and manufactured housing, it's only 5%, but according to the census, 34% of people in manufactured housing are disabled. So I think the data has to get to that level. Going through the data, I think there's a lot of good data. So maybe the demographer can help us read some of it. I got tripped up on household versus occupant. So you like CDC has stats of how many people have certain disabilities, but there wasn't a conversion of percent of population to households because we have multiple people in homes. And then on the CDC data and stuff, they're reporting the percent of people who have one type of disability or another, and they recognize that a lot of people will report multiple disabilities. I just want to make sure the data says, oh, well, we can't add up if I have hearing, vision, and mobility and it's all the same person. I don't want to provide 3 times the units if it's just one person. Does that make sense? And then I guess I think we should try to steer the different categories of disabilities that we're going to ask them to record, because that's going to link to the recommendations in the policy. So the number of type A units, that's mobility or physical disability. We talk a lot about cognition disabilities. I don't know if it's fair to lump all those together. And if we do, I don't think there's a design suggestion of what that ends up being. And then the sensory disabilities of vision and hearing, can that link to the communication unit or not? You know, those are some questions I think for the team, but that's some of the gaps when I did all my notes.
Paul, let me try to unpack this into pieces and see if we as a group can get into some ideas we want to test with the public. And I think the challenge is going to be a digestible and clear that doesn't get too wonky, but addresses some of the concerns of, are we double, triple counting, or by if someone identifies with multiple disabilities, does that skew the data? So we've got to figure out what data we want to collect. We've got to figure out how that data is clean and accurate. I might float to the group that getting it really clean and accurate is something to get into the weeds on when you develop your recommendation that go to the executive committee, rather than turning it into a one-page data description that we ask the public to not glaze over as they read that. And I'm not insulting the idea. I'm trying to imagine the average one property owner or small business or individual with lived experience who may be more tuned in. But let's tease this out of what, given what you've just talked about with the limits on who type A units serve, on the different types of disabilities we're talking about needing to know about and be able to solve for. This isn't, we're not collecting data because it's entertaining to collect, it's to solve a problem. So what idea might you put on the table of, let's make sure 174 collects A, B, or C, or that the state following 174 maintains collection and regular identification?
I guess to suggest maybe 3 broad categories: physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, and cognition. I don't know if that's too broad, but if we could organize the data that way, that might be a good start. Probably too broad.
And Karen, I appreciate you weighing in on the chat. I'm looking forward to inviting you for public comment when we get there at 4:45, and just want to acknowledge you being here and offering this, and the complexity of trying to get this, that we can't just put all IDD into one category. And I think what this group needs to find the balance of is, right now, what we are talking about is not the recommendations and the implementation strategies that you're going to provide to the executive committee of the task force. It's the ideas and the intent of them that we want to share with the public. But Karen, I certainly recognize the points you're making. Rochelle, and then David, and then Anais.
Thanks for that, Paul. And I would say, I think this is going to be a really delicate way to word things. We need to be very careful about the independent living philosophy here, and people being allowed to self-identify multiple disabilities, and kind of moving away from the medical model of things. But we have been leaning on the ILRU for their description of this, and I think they've got a pretty good one. I was trying to like pull up some of the information that they had in, and I'm sorry, ILRU stands, I can never remember what it totally stands for. The
Independent living resource utilization.
utilization is the word that always catches me up. Thank you so much, David. And it's under ilru.org and resources. But there's some pretty good definitions within there, and it's under the Housing and Services Partnership Accelerator Program. And they have kind of done some of this legwork in that. So I don't know if we can, I like to get low hanging fruit sometimes. So if ILRU has done some of the legwork in this, and there were 8 states that were identified in this, Colorado wasn't one of them. But there was a program that was done amongst 8 states, and they may have fleshed some of this out that we could glean.
Great. I appreciate that. Let me go to David and then Anais, and then Representative Ortiz, who has rejoined us. I'm going to have you offer any comments on what you've heard to date or the conversation we're having. David, your thoughts.
So I think that what we're wanting comment from the public is going to be, it needs to be a little more generalized, physical, sensory, and then also cognitive. And because you could have someone with physical disabilities who's blind and has a traumatic brain injury, and you have, I've had clients like that. So, it is one of those things of, it's better just to get a generalized knowledge in asking property owners what accommodations they already have in their units. Because that's what we're really trying to get at is, what do they think they have? Because we don't know that. I mean, we don't know all of the apartments that have roll-in showers, because transitioning people out of nursing homes was always the hardest, finding a roll-in shower or finding a landlord that would allow us to modify the unit with a roll-in shower and leave it, and leave it there so that if that person were to leave, somebody else with that need could move in there. So I think that's what we're trying to get at is what's out there that at least a property owner thinks in their mind is accessible, either for physical, sensory, or cognitive.
Thank you, David. Anais.
Kind of going along with that, I appreciate Karen's point. I can't wait for her to share her public comments. That there's just such a spectrum. So how do we be thorough but concise? I wonder if instead of identifying the disability, we make it more of a checklist of support needs of, these are the types of things I need to support my daily living, and have it be more specific to the accessibility needs and support level needs than what does that client fall into. I'm curious what the team thinks of that idea of, maybe we don't have to divide into types of disability, right? Because we can't generalize any of them, physical to IDD, but really have the data be centered around support needs and those environmental supports that they either now utilize or are in need of in the future.
Anais, let me pick up on that a little bit, and maybe you want to answer, or I welcome thoughts from others. If we're doing data collection, it's one thing for us to, and I love this idea of both the individual telling us, I think 174 started talking about what is kind of a dry and empirical study of what exists. We're talking bricks and steel and ramps. What idea might you offer to how do we collect the information from the individual? That's more here's what I need, as opposed to the property telling us these are the features.
Yeah, so, as some of us are familiar with waiver services, right? Individuals might need homemaker services, personal care attendant. They might need, physical accessibilities like that roll-in showers or the lower countertops. But really kind of like that waiver system is a menu items of things that an individual can get to support their independence in the community. Maybe this data can assess what currently they utilize in their community to live independently and to stay living independently. Whatever independence means, right? That's also a very wide range. But what level of interdependence do they need, or what level of supports they need in their environment? So those are the things that I know I'm thinking about with clients, right? I'm saying, oh, you want to live on your own, let's think about what would help you be successful living on your own. And really we focus on the environment being the assessment, right? And instead of, what do you have? Like, do you have this? Because really that won't tell us the full picture. Because within one diagnosis, there is a spectrum of how that shows up. And so really focusing it on what do you utilize currently rather than what do you have?
David, are your thoughts on this topic as well?
Well, on the topic I thought we were discussing, which is the data collection from property owners,
Yep.
housing providers, and that's the data collection that's important, because otherwise, if we're going to ask people with disabilities to disclose what they need, that's thousands and thousands and thousands of inputs, and I don't even know how you identify, because I'm a person with multiple disabilities, but if you didn't know me, you wouldn't know that.
Right.
You know? But I think the big thing is, how do we gauge this? And I think that we go back to the trying to get from property owners, housing providers, what do they have in their stock,
Yep.
their housing stock, that they think is accessible physically, sensory, cognitively, those kinds of things. I think that's what we should be asking, is because we're asking housing providers to tell us what's their housing stock look like. Because while Class A requires a lot of things, I will tell you that if you are going to lose your housing and you need to be able to a ramp to get in the door, I can tell you a lot of people will take any apartment they can at least slide their butt in the door to get there, because it's better than being homeless. Okay, so we have to think about, but it'd be nice to know where all those units might be, because we don't know that. I know that many, many years ago, DOH had, it was a rental where people who were looking to rent units could go onto their website and see what was available, whatever a landlord listed was available that might have some of the accessibility features. I don't think it ever really was utilized very much, but that's what we're looking for, is what's the stock and where is that stock? Because, if I've got a place in Elizabeth that has a roll-in shower that's affordable for someone, but they can't, Elizabeth is so far from being able to get their home care services. So, it's got to be, where is it and what do they have? And I think that's what this survey needs to be about.
Got it. No, point well taken, and I've captured that. That the data needs to be collected about what exists and what, to your point, property owners think they have or say they have, that addresses that. Anais, if I can get you to hold for 1 second on this, I'll get to you in next. I'm also going to tee up for everyone. In a minute, I'm going to start pushing you all on what does data mean for what the state should require? And by that, I don't mean in terms of should the state require that there be accessibility compliance, but we're going to start having the conversation now about if we find the need is 20% of units, are we requiring the 20%? And based on what we know now, are you prepared to put ideas on the table of what those numbers should be? Before I go there, Rep. Ortiz, I usually invite you in midway. I kind of let this conversation go, but want to invite you in to offer thoughts or questions for the group.
Yeah, I just want everyone to keep in mind too, as we're having a discussion about type A units and what's needed and what the data specifically reflects. Something to keep in mind, and this was iterated during the original stakeholding of this bill, is, there's some truth to like, well, type A only really impacts X amount of people. But I will always go back to one of the advocates with dwarfism that was like, technically, I'm not counted and my disability is not counted when it comes to type A units benefiting me. But I would be benefited from having a type A unit. It would benefit me because it would make my life easier, lower countertops, all these different things that are made mostly for people in wheelchairs also benefit me, right? So I just want everyone to keep that in mind, is that as we're talking about exact matching data, just again as a reminder that universal design hurts no one and helps everyone, and that type A might be keeping in mind quadriplegics or paraplegics, but it also positively would impact people that are aging, people with mobility issues, be a safer work environment for caregivers that are taking care of individuals that have these other disabilities, would also people with cerebral palsy, people with spina bifida, right? Like they would benefit from a type A unit, even if they're not considered specifically by the data set. So just want to call that out as well. And as we're getting deeper into discussions about caregiving infrastructure and people that have severe needs versus people that don't, and what we're trying to provide here and collecting and making sure that we have renters and sellers provide what they think they have when it comes to accessibility information, is to keep in mind too that we need to be prioritizing from the biggest intent of this bill at the 50-meter target, which is identifying what already exists, identifying where we're lacking and what we need to build to. That's like priority one. The next priority after is how do we incentivize or fund this? Priority three is how do we match people with disabilities to these units? And then priority four is, yes, we're creating this infrastructure around basic access, but how do we also create infrastructure around systems of care, right? Like that's not any less important, but that's kind of more of a periphery of what this subcommittee is here to discuss. I just want to point that out and name that.
Thank you, Representative. Let me bring it back to the group. And Anais, you had your hand up. We've got about 20 minutes to continue this conversation around data. I don't want to at all lose track of what Rep. Ortiz just noted, and that's really where we're going to go on July 31st when we're together next, is starting to dig into the, okay, today is about what data do we want to collect. I'm starting to tee up, we'll start it today, and the next meeting's really going to be about what is that tier one, tier two focus that we want to start moving the needle on. But Anais, the floor is yours for whatever is on your mind on this topic.
Yeah, just to David's point, I know we went on a little bit of a tangent towards how do we become inclusive of what can be reported in the current inventory, and just want to clarify that even coming from property managers, I mean, as with accessibility conversations in housing, it goes towards the physical end of things very quickly, where the cognitive piece isn't always included. So just to clarify that menu items of support needs that they can meet, if that gets addressed, that would be more inclusive of the IDD community, where that physical accessibility still might not lead to them being permanently housed. And so transferring that menu items to what property managers know that they can support with clients as far as the accessibility cognitively, not just the physical accessibility. So yes, just trying to be more specific to those things that they can provide, just as we are with clients when we're going through what they need.
I appreciate that. And nice. And let me kind of ground us a little bit, because I know so many of these pieces of conversation that I try to silo out, they intersect. They're not as clean as that. I have to try to do this so that we can have sections of ideas that we're sharing. It seems a little backwards. I know that I'm putting off until our next conversation what we want the state but to potentially require in terms of numbers of units now. And then we'll be talking about not only now, but how does that number adjust as we go forward? What I want to talk about for today and spend a few more minutes on is what do we need to know, not just to make that recommendation of what the state should require starting in next year or immediately, what type of data should be collected, how, and by whom, so that Colorado isn't playing catch up again. So that 15 years from now, we're not having another conversation about what do we know, what is needed. So I would love thoughts in addition to piggybacking onto the 174 work and looking broadly at these three categories of physical, sensory, and cognitive, including drilling down to the geographic area. Thoughts on what else the state should be thinking so that this is systemic transformation, not one-time data collection this year or the 5-year period of 174. Paul, I'll let you jump in first.
I didn't think you'd come to me that quick. This isn't an answer to your systemic question. Can you come back to me, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Who wants to lean in on? So 174, and I personally, I don't know if anybody does, I don't know the mechanisms that they're putting in place to carry out their duties in the coming years, but it's a one-time, as I understand it, study of housing needs. So it's looking at inventory, it's looking at population trends, it's looking at demographic data. But if we want to make sure that Colorado is able to fulfill the needs of Coloradans with disabilities in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and be responsive to changes, what do we need to be collecting, and who do you think should be doing that? Do we expand the asks we make of our local housing authorities? Is this about municipal jurisdictions? Is this adding to what we ask of the state demographer's office? Who has thoughts on how we make sure we stay current instead of needing another task force to solve a problem that we solved for a moment in time? Rochelle.
I would think this would land somewhere. This is my stab at this, but just looking at the data that ILRU and ACL put out, somewhere between, and I think to the state program for digital equity that we've been working on, we've really leaned heavily between the state demographer's office and the state library's office. The library's office for the state of Colorado has had a lot of the data that we didn't think that the state demographer had, and then they've collaborated together to give us some of that broadband infrastructure and digital equity program data that we've needed. So just kind of adding in, throwing the librarians in there for good measure.
Appreciate that. Cassidy, I'll go to you, and I'd like everyone to think about, given your experiences and your work, how much of this is a state responsibility, how much of it is a local leaders or office and officials responsibility, and where is it both? But Cassidy, your thoughts on these?
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of like, how do we get this information? And it's kind of building a little bit on David's ideas of like potentially self-reporting. And I personally am not a property owner, and I'm not in the development space or anything like that. I'm wondering if there are checkpoints that, like apartment complex owners, even just single condo owners, single family home owners have to like touch base at all with the state or their local jurisdiction, if there's any point where we could attach this to that. And then I guess my idea is building off David's, where they get to kind of get to say, here are the things I believe are the accessible features, but I do think also it's helpful to have like checkpoints, I guess, defining what are some accessible features. And I know I've taken a deep dive into the Kelsey's design standards, and they have like lists of a bunch of different types of accessibility features that could be part of this checklist that homeowners or apartment complex owners could go through and mark these off. But then also permitting a space for them to say, this wasn't included, but I think this is an accessibility feature as well. As far as the reporting side of things, though, that's kind of what I was getting to at the beginning of my comment. I'm not exactly sure how that would look, but I'm wondering if there's already a touch point that these property owners have with the state or some form of government that we could just build on.
Thank you, Cassidy. And I know, we had the idea earlier that, and let me get back to it. We have establishing a statewide process and requirement for conducting the accessibility report on all properties by a licensed architect or engineer when they are bought, sold, or refinanced. I'm wondering if there isn't something we could build on that, Cassidy, to what you're raising, to maintain an ongoing database of what exists out there. And Shelley or Paul, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. We've got different moments in time. We've got on construction, we've got on initial sale, we've got on refinance or subsequent transactions. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on how the state, and I don't think anybody's going to suggest that every year we inventory every unit, but thoughts on how we could keep more accurate and more current data about that inventory. And then I'm going to challenge the entire group to help with ideas on the demand side. Shelley?
Yeah, thanks, Barrick. Well, the city and county of Denver does require, they put in a new requirement that all property owners that did rental housing, you had to register with the city. So that's in place with a city and county like Denver, one of the largest cities in the state. But how do you impose that across the state, right? It looks like what you're, the architect, engineer, when it's bought, sold, or refinanced. But what's missing here is developed. And I guess one thing that I think about, CHAPA provides the LIHTC award, and is there a way to track what's being developed through, developments that receive the low-income housing tax credits for affordable housing? Could it be tracked from there where CHAP is providing data? Just a thought.
Appreciate it. Other thoughts, and I'm not trying to force a conversation to overcomplicate it. I want to be as open in the brainstorm of what are all of the points of data that are happening that we could collect. Paul?
Maybe a simple one to start with is institutionalized housing versus independent. So in the building code, anything that's an R occupancy is treated one way, and then anything that is an I occupancy is another. So that includes independent living facilities of some degree, but if we could split it out that way. The American Housing Survey, I think, does a really good job breaking it down by size of project. And it gives persons with disabilities tied to housing size. It just doesn't make that last connection.
Any other thoughts you'd like to weigh in on the inventory side? Let me ask the group, do we have sufficient information on the need, on the demand side? And on an ongoing basis, do you have ideas you want to offer of what Colorado should be doing? Paul, is that your hand back up?
Yeah.
Please.
If I might be so bold.
Please do.
Looking at the census and then American Housing Survey,
yeah,
3-story and greater multifamily housing, stuff that's generally going to be required to have type A and type B housing is 18% of the housing. And when we go back to policies and we're talking all these percentages, that's what I think is going to get targeted first. And like I said, 70% of housing is single family detached. I think the data is there to show that we don't have a requirement for single family detached yet. It has a similar quantity of population that's disabled that lives in it. So even if we start with a 1% requirement of type A housing and single family new construction, if I do my math right, that equates to, in essence, requiring 13% of multifamily housing to have a type A. I just put that out there trying to be bold and start conversation.
Thoughts and reactions. And to be clear, with 19 minutes to go, and given that in 5 minutes, I'm going to open it to public comment, I'm not going to ask you to hash this out to where you're ready for me to take it to the public tomorrow morning. This is conversation that will be continued at our next meeting. But reactions or thoughts sparked by what Paul just floated about what 1% would mean. Oh, you've got everybody speechless, which means the floor is yours to run the idea, I think. I'm kidding. We will come back. I would love for folks to give some thought to that and come ready to really dig into that idea on our next conversation when we are going to start getting into what would shifts in requirements look like and how can they help solve the need. Go ahead, Paul.
If I may follow it up with another, I mentioned mobile housing has probably the highest percent of disabled population. Mobile housing is governed by the state building code. It's one of the only sectors of housing that is. And if we're making recommendations on a state level, it'd be really easy to amend the state building code.
Reactions on that? Well, I think we've got at least a few seeds that will start the conversation on our next meeting. Before I open it up to public comment, I do want to give a few more minutes. Paul, you referenced the census data and housing surveys. I would love thoughts, if anyone has them, on are there better ways for Colorado, not just on a one-time basis, but on an ongoing basis, to maintain better insights and line of sight into what the need and demand is and is going to be. Brian.
Sure. I think I don't know if I have a good answer to this question, but it's something that has struck me as we've been talking kind of throughout this whole period of time is we do a lot of extrapolation of data, right?
Yeah.
Like it's okay, the census said this, therefore it means that. Like I don't know the mechanism of getting at better information than saying like, and I'm not going to be able to quote the data correctly that Paul talked about earlier, but say it's 18% of people in Colorado, according to the census, are living with a disability. That means, going from that big top line number. I just don't know how we get there. But I'd like us to be able to do something more than extrapolate like from census. I guess I'm rambling now. I'm frustrated by our lack of like hardcore like polling kind of data rather than census data, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this?
Um, just to defend the census, Brian, I was super surprised when I looked at it. It goes down to the county level annually, year by year. It tells you the difference between duplex and fourplex and tenplex. It's more nuanced than I thought it was.
Is that in terms of, identifying, not necessarily identifying information, but information about people living with disabilities in those communities, or does it go down to like the housing type? I guess those are two
On a
different
per
data points.
housing type basis, it just asks, do you identify with a disability or not?
Okay. Well, that's better than I thought it was.
What I'm going to do is pause this conversation for now. I think people are a little bit at idea fatigue and overwhelmed, but we've gotten some creative seeds to start our next conversation. We do have a couple of members who are not members of the committee online. Let me just check in with them. Karen, did you want to address the committee?
I'm happy to. Thank you for allowing me to. I think if it's a big enough issue, it goes to the state, much like the census, because it is an issue. We are growing, and the amount of people with disabilities that aren't recognized right now are going to be on the streets if action isn't taken. I am a parent of a child who is 21. I don't have family in town. I don't have a great plan for when I die, who's going to follow up and take care of her. All the recommendations that came out on your sheet, they're great. They didn't speak to one thing that my child could do. She's not picking up a phone to ask a question. She doesn't have those abilities. So when I read that, I'm like, is this for the IDD community? Because I didn't read anything on there that spoke to them. I did make notes, and I really appreciate your time and everything, you guys. I love the way the ILRU broke down need. I think there's some great categories there. Is it hearing? Is it sight? Is it living day to day? I can't go to the bathroom. I can't. Is it social? So I thought that was a really good breakdown and a way to break it down. I think you have to ask, what's the age of the caretaker? I'm 65, I'm not getting any younger. So, there's a lot of parents groups that are creating housing that we need the support of the state and the federal government to be a part of. Seniors live. My daughter needs what a senior needs at her fingertips to give her more independence. Because, if she's cooking, she's making pasta every day. If she could go down to a cafeteria, she's going to have choice. She's going to have community. She's going to have activities that she can read on a board and choose where to go. So there's a lot to take into consideration when you start building with intention. I get getting the units and where are the units? Absolutely, we need to know. There's a lot of people who need. They're living in manufactured homes because they can't afford anything. My daughter gets Social Security. She can afford to pay $800 a month for rent. So that doesn't exist here in Denver, in Colorado. David, thank you for mentioning your number 4. I'd like your number 4 about the supportive piece to move up a little bit, especially in the planning stages, because I think it's a key piece. And every time I go to housing committees and talk about housing, the IDD community is not mentioned. Like someone said earlier, when we build things that are good for one, it's an advantage to someone else too. So, as senior communities are built, how about giving 10% to the IDD community? That would be a huge benefit for those who have disabilities, that have cognitive disabilities, that can't manage on their own. I know I'm speaking fast, running out of time, but I greatly appreciate what you do. David, thank you for making this happen, and everybody that's working on this team. Just continue to listen to the higher needs folks that don't have the abilities to accomplish the things. Does anybody here have a child with disabilities on this panel? Curious. I think you need one or two.
Some
I
of
mean,
us,
really, where's their voice?
yeah, some of us are living with disabilities, so have lived experience personally.
Yeah, and there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum. My daughter is not getting dressed in the morning unless I'm getting her dressed. Things aren't happening. She's not making a social call. I plan everything. I get on the phone with Medicaid. I have to wait 2 hours for someone to answer the phone for me, only to tell me it's a social security issue, who then sends me back to Medicaid. So the systems are complicated. And how do we make them more simpler? And it all is tied to housing, but a roof is not enough. And if there's one thing you walk away, a roof is not enough. So thank you again for everything you do. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Karen, and the frustration is understood. I do hope that when we start getting these ideas, and you were with us at the very beginning, what I shared is this group's ideas, the first set of ideas will go up on Engage Dora tomorrow morning for public response. As we continue to refine ideas around each of these topics, we'll be putting them up on a rolling basis. I hope you'll take some time and share your thoughts on what the strengths are, what your concerns are, and that you'll talk with other parents and people you know, and encourage them to do the same. Tim Dolan, I don't know if you were joining just to listen in. We always welcome you. Did you want to address the group?
Thanks, Barrick. I did not want to address, I didn't have comments today, except to say, to echo Karen's thanks to the group for working on this stuff. I really appreciate it. It's great discussions going on here, and I can see that you're all super engaged, so thank you for that. And also just to know that you're not alone in this. There's a lot of other groups that are working on these kinds of things, and we're all working together. And my hope is that we'll really be, additive to each other's efforts. And I think we will be. And so I'm glad to stay engaged. Thanks for calling on me, though, Barry.
My pleasure, and thank you for being here and for everything that you've done. We've got 7 minutes. That doesn't mean I'm going to talk for 7 minutes. I'm going to remind you that our next meeting is on the 31st. I will follow up with an email to all of you when our first batch of ideas go live tomorrow. I've been editing in real time as we've been talking, but I haven't wanted to be totally distracted. So when we get done here, I'll clean those up to make sure that they make sense. Before we go, Representative Ortiz, always appreciate you being here. Do you want to offer any closing words to this group?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for the broad but also deep and thoughtful discussions around some of the solutions that we need to be hitting on here. I appreciate Barrett kind of framing this on where, because the focus always should be the original intent of the original bill, and to understand that yet there will always be, different aspects of community that we need to serve in different ways, right? Like in the outdoor and the housing, I know you guys talk about transportation. Well, maybe one of CDU's main focuses can be access and transportation, right? Like the original intent of this discussion wasn't necessarily living facilities, but in getting either aging or other disabled folks that could be living on their own out of living facilities and living independently, simply by making sure we're making the unit physically accessible and or also accessible for people with IDDs. Like I keep hearing the statement that IDDs are not being considered, and I feel like that's a little unfair because we do have representation by the ARC here. Not only that, but we are talking about plain language. We are talking about different aspects to make it accessible. There's always more that we can do. But again, the focus has to be what the original intent of the original bill was. And in doing that and in increasing the independence and access for some, we're making room for others. I love this idea about maybe we can do 10% in nursing homes. Well, nursing homes are already understaffed and overpopulated, right? But if we can make housing accessible, not just for aging folks, but for their caregivers that are then coming into these apartment units and caring for them, that will free up space in these living centers, right? Like the solutions you're creating here aren't just going to be impacting here. They're going to have ripples throughout many different aspects of community. Those with more severe disabilities that might not necessarily be the target and focus of this. Like if we want to talk about living facilities, that does deserve its own task force. It absolutely does deserve its own focus. But just to keep make sure that we are hitting the main focuses of this, and if and when we have time to make sure we're talking about surrounding areas as well. I just really want to thank everybody of their times and their talents, and it's been a great discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Carrie, I'm going to go to you last. Remind me, July 31st, correct?
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot, Derek. July 31st, we are meeting at, sorry, calendar slow. July 31st, 1:30 to 3:30. And I know a few of you had some trouble finding the link. So I'm going to check, double check, and recheck and send you emails to make sure everyone has the link on hand. But thank you all again for being flexible with us and helping to find these times. Really appreciate you making the extra time this month.
And as you see, we do use the full time. It's been necessary. I'll echo Carrie's appreciation and the representatives. As I said, we'll get these ideas cleaned up. They're going to go on Engaged Dora tomorrow. Yours will be the first set of ideas that are rolled out. They will be followed shortly by ideas from the government subcommittee, who has some ideas on what it should look like for persons with disability to be able to run for and serve in elected office. Then in the coming days, we'll also roll out ideas from the CADA, or the Legal Rewrite Subcommittee, as well as the Outdoor Recreation Committee. But you guys will be first. We'll shoot an email to you tomorrow when those go live, and would ask you to do everything you can to help spread those among your network so we can get input. Paul, was that a hand up or a slipped hand?
I was just going to ask if we were going to get a link.
You will get a link tomorrow morning, absolutely. And we'll also start getting that out on social media to support getting as much input as possible. With that, thank you all so much. We will see you on the 31st. Be in touch by email tomorrow and between now and then.
Thank you all.